Welcome everyone. Bon, bienvenue à tout le monde. Mon nom est Louis Baumier. Je suis avec l'Institut de l'énergie trottier à Polytechnique Montréal. On my name and on behalf of Natural Resources Canada, I want to welcome you to this second of 5 sessions where we're going to be presenting the various modeling projects that were part of the Energy Modeling Initiative for a second year in a row. Before going to the first presentation, just a few housekeeping notes. Each presenters will have 30 minutes to present their project, including Q&A period. We will enforce that limit of 30 minutes by respect to others and everyone on that call, since I'm sure you're all quite busy. Please keep your microphone on mute during the presentations. You're welcome to post some question in the chat box or some comments if you want. During the Q&A session, please raise your hand before asking a question. Of course, we're going to go through the question in the chat box also. This session is being recorded, and the recording and the visual material presented will be made available on the website, of course, with the authorization of their authors. Just a few words about this initiative. It's the second year in a row that Natural Resources Canada is promoting this initiative. It is executed by the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier. I won't say much more, just to keep all the time possible for presenters, but if you want to know a bit more about the proposition we made last year, follow the link that is there. And if you want to see other projects that have been funded, there's also the second link that is there for you to consult. Today we have 3 presentations. The first one will talk about the prosumers in the electricity market, and I will now give the control to Ms. Elizaveta Kuznetsova, who will be leading the presentation.
Thank you, Louis. Yes, Elizaveta, just fine. I will share my screen. Is it good?
On my side, yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Louis. Thank you for the presentation. So today I will talk about our project on the effect of small-scale residential prosumers and how they can contribute to electrification and deep decarbonization of Canada's energy system. I will show you an application for Ontario. So this project was done with Professor Miguel Anjos. Here is the content of my presentation. I will start by presenting a general framework for the policymaker. Then a model of a household and how a jurisdiction, for instance, Ontario, can be represented. I will talk about application and results and will conclude with a model analysis and future development. So various countries, including Canada, adopted the vision for decarbonization and electrifications of their energy systems from now to 2050. And the policymakers can play a key role in this transformation process by defining various economic and financial aspects of the policies, such as electricity tariff, subsidies to promote the integration of renewables, different scheme under which renewables and storage can be connected and operated, and other various incentives. So our simulation model can be used by a policymaker, for example, to illustrate the impact of different policies he defined on electricity consumers. And these consumers in their turn can contribute to goals of decarbonization and electrifications of the entire energy system. Our model here is done using agent-based modeling approach, meaning that different stakeholders in the energy system is represented with the individual agents, starting from the grid operator on the top, who can also act as a policymaker, define the policy and propagate it in the system through local distribution companies towards electricity consumers. Electricity consumers can react to this policy, and this feedback can be collected and used by the grid operator and distribution companies to adjust their policies and then repeat probably the simulation to see what will happen. Here, for this particular study, we will focus only on the bottom level of electricity consumers because the policy definitions and adjustment will be done by ourselves manually. And the application will be presented for Ontario. So each household is simulated as an individual agent who uses various inputs, starting from tariffs and the trends of these tariffs for the next years, technologies, investment conditions. We have the technical specifications of various technologies, environmental conditions where a household is situated, and operational conditions if we talk about the load profile in the household. In the output, the model simulates the transformation of a conventional consumer in a prosumer, starting from the prosumer with a PV system, then advanced prosumer with a PV and electric battery, and the ultimate decision could be to go off-grid with a larger PV system and seasonal storage based on a power to hydrogen to power technology. These decisions are done based on an optimization model, which aims to minimize the net present value of future expenses. So the objective function includes capital investments in various technologies. We have also operational expenses to maintain these technologies annually, replacement costs, because at the end of the product warranty, if our technology fails and we cannot repair it, we will need to replace it. Electricity bill will be paid to the external grid in case if our prosumer or consumer operate in a grid connected mode, and minus avoided costs, which is actually the reduction of electricity bill due to the self-generation and the self-consumption. So in case if our prosumer goes to disconnect, avoided cost will be equal to the electricity bill because it will no longer pay any fee to the external grid. So our optimization model allows to simulate a progressive expansion of renewable energy systems. So we can start and plan the expansions year by year. And the electricity bill and avoided cost are calculated based on the optimization model for the optimal power dispatch in the household, depending on what type of technology our household has. So how many agents we need, how many households we need to model to represent a jurisdiction? Ideally, we need to select this number. So each typical household will be representative of different areas with various tariffs, different environmental conditions. And if we go even further, we can also talk about the difference of appliances used in the different households in different regions. So difference of consumption pattern. And for this particular study, we will mostly respect the two first conditions, and we use the approach which is currently actually used by the Ontario Energy Board, where the effect of tariff is evaluated for a typical household in each distribution area. So we will have for Ontario 67 consumer agents representing 67 distribution areas. And these consumers agents will be a typical household with average electricity consumption of 700 kilowatt-hour per month. Then we ask ourselves a question, will all other households in the jurisdiction behave the same way as this typical household? So we conducted a bunch of simulations for various combinations of different tariffs conditions and for households with a different average monthly consumptions. And here you can see the overview. I will not go into details. You can read more in our report, but I will say that this helped us to identify the size of this consumption window where households with this average monthly consumption will behave in the same way. Now then we know with which monthly consumption household will behave in the same way. We will probably need to use some measurements data from a jurisdiction. Unfortunately, we do not have access for Ontario. So what we've done, we use available probability distributions, similarly that what was done for consumption study for detached houses in Sweden, and also few measurements data available for Ontario. So we calculated an accumulative distribution function using the size of this consumption window identified previously. And we found that around 40% of households in Ontario could have a very same strategic behavior. This will represent over 1 million of single detached households for all Ontario. So let's start with the application of our framework. Let's define first potential policy pathways we will test here. Starting with the major assumptions. So we are looking only on households under residential tariff plan, and they are heated with the natural gas, which is the majority for Ontario. The bill structure that you will see here below will remain unchanged for the next 30 years. Renewables will be connected under the net metering scheme, and electricity rates will be in their pre-pandemic level, because currently with all lockdowns we observe very high variations of electricity rates. For this study, our policymaker will change the total variable rate, fixed service charges, and will activate or not a rebate which could be applied on the top of the electricity bill. So the first policy pathway we selected is very close to what currently, how is done currently in Ontario. It's the actual pricing with rebate. So the total bill increase in average for all households in Ontario by 5.5% annually. This increase is due to the 3% increase of fixed charges inside the electricity bill, and the rest, around 7%, is due to the total variable rate increase. To slow down this increase of the total electricity bill, Ontario applies a rebate, which is equal to around 20% of the total electricity bill. This rebate is reevaluated every year. Basically, it's increased, and the duration of the program is not really clear. So we assume that the rebate will be active for the 5 next years. And as an alternative pricing policy, we selected another one where the total electricity bill will be increased only by 4% annually due to some different measures. The fixed charges will be increased in the same way as the policy pathway number 1, and the total variable rates will increase by 4.5% annually, and there will be no rebate applied for this type of policy. Few words about data our model uses. So it relies almost entirely on available online resources, starting from different historical data from distribution companies and the grid operators, various governmental reports. We are using also reports and studies from research institutes and agencies, data from technology manufacturers and distributors. Some resources, media resources focused on green tech can be very useful because they give a very brief idea of what is currently happening in the sector. Weather data sets, and obviously scientific publications and specialized journals. Our model also uses 2 modeling toolboxes. First one to simulate power output with a PV array, by taking into account various parameters. And the second one is to simulate the household load profile. So this is also based on some scientific publications and some of my experience, what I was doing before for the microgrid energy management. So we input various data in our simulation model, and let's go directly to the results, the global effect for Ontario. Here, the illustration of how these 2 policies can contribute in the achievement of global Ontario power system goals. In the red one is the policy pathway number 1, and the blue is policy pathway number 2. On the right side, you can see the example of global goals for power system in Ontario. To be clear, Ontario doesn't define clearly the numbers it want to reach on the 2050. So these goals, we define them based on an evolving scenario from the Canada's Energy Future report done by Canada Energy Regulator and some our other assumptions. So what we can see here is that both policies can contribute in the achievement of these goals. A very interesting addition of total renewable capacity, around 20%. Almost 50% of total installed battery storage capacity can come from prosumers. The average total annual PV generation, also almost 50%, can be done on a level of very small prosumers. We can contribute by around 10% to the CO2 savings emissions in the power sector. And both policies can contribute in the reduction of electricity bill for prosumers. Unfortunately, the policy pathway number 1 can stimulate some disconnection. So you can see here around 7.4 megawatt can be disconnected from the grid. And also the policy number 1 is quite costly in terms of rebate to be paid directly to the electricity consumers. So let's see what's happening for different typical household and different distribution areas in Ontario. So these two figures correspond to the year 2050 at the end of the planning horizon. On the left one, policy pathway number 1, and on the right side, policy pathway number 2. What we can see here is that policy pathway number 1, the majority of typical households and different distribution areas will be advanced prosumers, meaning that we will have a PV system and electric batteries. And you can see red dots. These are distribution areas where households may tend to disconnect from a grid because the electricity bill will be very heavy. For the policy pathway number 2, prosumers will be divided between 2 configurations. First one, a prosumer just with a PV array, and advanced prosumer with a PV array and the electric battery. Let's see what's happening for some sensitive locations. For instance, we can choose here a location in Chapleau. For the policy pathway number 1, it could disconnect. The household there can disconnect. And for the policy pathway number 2, it can become advanced prosumer. So here is an illustration of what's happening under the policy pathway number 1 for a typical household situated in this distribution area. On the left side, these are discounted annual cash flows related to different investment and expenses and avoided costs for all planning horizon. And on the right side, this is the optimal power dispatch illustrated just for 1 year, just for 1 day for every year, depending on what type of technology we have. So if you see the cash flows here, 5 years of rebate applications, and then just a few years after the rebate program is terminated, our household will tend to expand its renewable generator, invest in a seasonal storage, this is a big red bar, and to disconnect from the grid completely. So you can see in the negative side of the cash flows, this is all avoided costs. For the policy pathway number 2, the situation will be different. Our household will remain connected. It will deploy some PV generator, will expand it a bit, and then will integrate electric batteries. So we will use the power from the external grid, but at the same time from the PV array and also the electric battery. We can compare the effect of 2 policies for a typical household in Chapleau. For example, by looking on total cash flows. Here we are mostly interested in the 2 last lines. Balance, this is a value of the objective function for 2 different policies under which the consumer is operating. And the benchmark, the last line, the benchmark is done based on the convention. If the household remains a conventional consumer and do not deploy any renewable generator and storage, just remain connected to the grid and pay all electricity bill to the grid. So what we can see here by comparing these numbers is that the electricity bill becomes quite expensive, and even large investment in some seasonal storage can be very interesting in this case. to avoid payments to the external grid. So let's summarize some policy implications here. We saw that both policies can contribute to the global energy system goals. However, the policy number one can generate some undesirable effects related to system reliability. It may stimulate the disconnection of households in different locations. And also the first policy can create require a lot of investment to pay the rebate for electricity bill. So probably the policymaker could try to define its economic and financial measures closer to the policy pathway number two. So what we can think here, he can think to explore measures to mitigate the total bill increase, for example, by acting on variable rates. It can help some distribution companies to diversify their service offer and develop new business model to integrate renewable generation and storage and to stimulate the development of these markets, and also to involve prosumers in the demand response. We saw that the disconnection can be possible with the technology based on power to hydrogen to power storage. So maybe it could be interesting to rethink of this use of such technology to keep our prosumers connected and to integrate this technology in a low carbon hydrogen strategy for Canada. We saw also that households with different monthly consumption will react differently to different policies. So it may be interesting to reconsider the definition of a typical household to evaluate policy effect for a jurisdiction. I will conclude now by summarizing some model features and future developments. So our model is applicable to different jurisdictions of different sizes. We can talk here about municipality. You saw the application for a province, and we can also go to the scale of country. We can define various model inputs manually, or they can also come from other models as long as the structure of the input data is respected. Currently, our model is deterministic, so it means there is no uncertainty accounted in the modeling related to different variability of conditions. These can be upgraded, but we need to think about that the uncertainty modeling can require a lot of computational resources. So probably the deterministic will be the best option here, especially if we are talking about large jurisdictions with a lot of agents. For this specific study, we account only for PV model, but other technologies such as wind turbine may be also included in the investment model and the dispatch model. For instance, I have already the model of wind turbine, so it can be just switched on, and it can participate in the simulation. Our future developments are mainly related to different scientific communications. So we are preparing some journal papers for the journal Energy Strategy Reviews. We are looking towards the process of model licensing and the technology transfer. So we are really keen to develop some collaborative opportunities with the policymakers, for example. So if you are interested and you want to explore a little bit more your case study, we will be happy to have a discussion with you. And obviously different model and algorithm improvements can be also integrated during future development. The model interface can be very useful for technology transfer and to give the possibility for a decision maker to use directly our model without actually us, but just by using some simple interface. And the development of the model related to the automatic policy search, then the model then the policy upgrade and adjustment can be done directly by some algorithm integrated in the optimization model. This will be all for me. Thank you all. I hope I'm on time.
Thank you, Elisaveta. Yep, we still have 8 minutes to ask some questions. There is one posted in the chat box about what did you consider grid flow? What were the grid flow constraints in the modeling, and also about the capital recovery for existing infrastructure?
So the grid flow, there is no optimal power flow here, just to be clear. All power dispatch of different technologies, PV and storage, is done by considering different constraints for the operation of this kind of technologies. And we assume that there is no particular constraints to integrate PV in different households or different storage. So there is no optimal power flow, let's say, between different levels, so from consumers to distribution companies and to the top of the grid operator. Capital recovery for existing infrastructure. What does it mean, capital recovery for existing infrastructure?
It means that as more and more people start using their own supply, you will not be having as much recovery of the costs that are already embedded in the system, paid by those consumers, in which case that has to flow to the other consumers, raising the rates. So you've treated this as a linear model, whereas it's a non-linear model dependent on the adoption of the prosumer option.
Yes, you're completely right. Actually, these, I'm not sure that it will be so easy to integrate and to model actually the rates increase related to the appearance of prosumers. I need to study this question more, but we can evaluate this for the additional indicator for the impact, for example, for the entire jurisdiction, saying that if, for example, 20–30% of consumers will be prosumers, then to keep the same revenues for example, distribution companies and electricity generation companies, we need to increase rates and the charges by this percentage. But I want also to highlight...
You might want to look at what happened in Hawaii and what happened in Arizona, because these natural experiments have already been run. So you can do exactly what happened. The first thing that happened was that entry of prosumers was constrained. The other thing that happened was that the feed-in tariff was reduced.
Yes, here there's no feed-in tariff. And I wanted to attract your attention that the simulation horizon at 30 years. So basically the transformation of consumers into prosumers must be progressive, and local distribution companies and the energy system in global must somehow follow this change by adjusting their business models. So nobody will expect that all this 40% of prosumers will become available in the energy system, and everybody will generate the same amount of electricity and expect the same amount of revenues they had before. So this is also the question that the assumption that the system will evolve also progressively due to appearance and the changes of way people will consume and generate electricity. Only if the charges are so high that everybody will become prosumers at the same time. In this case, yes, it will be a massive shock, and yes, this will be painful.
And Hadi, you had also a comment in the chat box. I guess was that linked to the adoption rate?
Yeah.
So
you
want to comment on that?
Thor Jensen's PhD was about looking at how government subsidies for ground source heat pumps promoted fuel switching around Canada, in particular from oil and gas to electricity in Ontario. We had access to direct household data on all of their characteristics and discovered that first of all, almost all the remote households could switch with a payback period of less than 3 years in Ontario, because they're relying on propane, which is super expensive compared to electricity. but less than 10% of those households adopted this because the reliability of the electricity supply in remote areas is questionable in Ontario. So that has two implications. One is that they really care about reliability, and this may be an extra boost, which is a non-economic, non-captured in your agent model for having reliable supply where they usually get cut off, which is in the winter. And the other is that I'm not sure they act as rational agents looking at discounted costs and benefits.
Yes. Obviously, all this component of uncertainty, how the actual household will behave is absent here. But what we must think of this model also is probably in case if a consumer wants to become a prosumer, he will also purchase some sort of a smart appliance helping to manage this kind of technology. And in this smart appliance, we can also have this model helping actually to expand what I already had in my household. So in this case, the rationality will be brought, but this kind of simulation tool could be brought directly through the smart appliance in your household. And I will just say that I know very well Tor Jensen, so he's my former colleague from the master in France. So I will just have a closer look on conclusions in his PhD, and I will be happy to add some improvements in the model.
Excellent, thank you very much, Elisaveta. That brings us to the end of our 30-minute period. I will now pass the floor to Mr. Ralph Torrey and Yuil Herbert from Sustainability Solutions Group. Gentlemen, I think you're already there, right?
Aha, how's that?
It's good from my point of view.
Perfect. So we're going to talk a little bit about the implications of decarbonization pathways for electricity grids at a pretty high level. And so we have been doing a lot of work with municipalities across Canada on helping them to understand pathways to achieve decarbonization of communities, looking at the energy system as a whole, the built environment within the municipal boundaries. This is one example from City of Ottawa. They had a project called Energy Evolution, and it responded to a climate emergency declaration that the Council of City of Ottawa passed. And our mandate was to identify decarbonization or a pathway that aligned with 1.5 degrees for the city. And so we use a spatial model called CityInSight, which we developed with our colleagues, What If Technologies, to develop these pathways. And they are, it's a very consultative process with community members and advisory groups and city staff. And most of the analysis is done on an annual basis. And I put the link to what one of these reports looks like on this slide. And this is the kind of result that we generate. So City of Ottawa, when you look at the emissions from a spatial perspective within the municipal boundaries, are about 4.9 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. The pathway that we evaluate takes it down to pretty much near zero by 2040, which is a steep decline. And that involves the transportation sector, the building sector, the energy sector, solid waste, land use, agriculture, and so on. So all of those dimensions are represented within these types of pathways. And we track that typically for transportation zones within the city. So we, in Ottawa's case, we divided it up into approximately 500 spatial zones, and we're representing all the activity within those zones. The implication of that is that we track energy on an annual basis. And that means that we can show what the impacts are in terms of how much electricity is consumed year over year, or how much natural gas is consumed year over year but we have not dived one step down, which is to look at how that impacts the electricity grid. So this is a typical pathway. This is again for City of Ottawa. You can see the electricity is the yellow chunk, and this is really an electrification scenario. We're electrifying both heating and transportation. Starts off around 28 million gigajoules of electricity consumption in 2016. And in this scenario, electricity climbs to 45 million gigajoules by 2050, which is a 190% increase. So that's what's happening in terms of the transformation of the energy system. In other scenarios for other cities, we also looked at hydrogen and renewable natural gas and carbon capture and other aspects, but at the heart of most of these scenarios is electrification. Electrification plus one other key ingredient, which is a lot of efficiency gains. And these efficiencies come from a few different areas, retrofits being a core part. And we've been arguing that retrofits are kind of the magic sauce that allows us to electrify without blowing the grid up. But that's an easy thing to say when you're looking at the grid in terms of an annual energy consumption without understanding peaks. So this is just the highlight in terms of end use, and you can really see space heating dominates the energy system within City of Ottawa, and also is the major opportunity in terms of the efficiency gains, but as well as transportation. Transportation is another area where there are a lot of efficiency gains as a result of switching from the internal combustion engine to the electric engine. But the space heating gains are a combination of the efficiency of heat pumps, but also the retrofit package that we implement. So this is a picture, Sankey diagrams, which show the source of the energy and then how it's used in which sectors, and then which energy is either conversion losses or useful at the end on the right-hand side. These are two snapshots. So there's a Sankey on the top, they're both 2050. The one on the top represents a business as usual or business plan scenario, and the one on the bottom represents a low carbon scenario. And while we saw in this slide, so I'll just go back here, that electricity actually increases from 2016 to 2050. In the Sankey diagram, we show that the electricity consumption is actually more or less flat when you account for things like population growth, because Ottawa is projected to grow significantly. So you can see electricity consumption in the business as usual scenario, which is the circle on the top, is 41 petajoules. On the bottom, the electricity consumption is 47 petajoules. So even though we've electrified heating and transportation, electricity consumption on an annual basis has not significantly increased by 2050. And this is a finding that we've encountered consistently in a number of our projects with cities across Canada. So I think that's been an important story for us to say or to communicate to the grids or the utilities working in the cities where we're developing these scenarios, is that overall electricity consumption doesn't increase. But then they immediately come back to us and say, that's great, but what happens in terms of peaks? And so, what's going on here? I'm just going to skip over that one. Actually, I should just highlight that this vision of electrification of the future is a real vision, and we are seeing that play out in a lot of the cities we're working with. This is an interesting trend that is just starting to emerge where cities are actually banning new gas stations. More common trend is that a number of cities are banning any sort of gas connections in new buildings, or any sort of gas appliances in new buildings. And I think Vancouver will be the first city in Canada to implement a similar sort of requirement. Most of these projects these requirements are in the US so far. But the electrification agenda is really driving the low carbon trajectories that we're seeing. And then I think the general discourse is the electrification agenda will really drive peaks within the grid. And that would be a common assumption that one would make. So we were fortunate to have the opportunity to work with a large portfolio of buildings in the Ottawa area to do much more detailed analysis. And I'll just pass it over to Ralph to start to introduce some of the insights that we've gained from that process. So over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Yul. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. Yul said that we were looking at this from a high level, but it's also the case that, I mean, we model for a living. So that means a couple of things. One is that we are usually responding to very immediate needs of clients who are looking for help with problems that they're facing or challenges. And secondly, the approach that we tend to take in doing that is a bottom-up approach, in the sense that the models that we're working with simulate in great detail the physical energy using infrastructure and equipment and vehicles from the ground up. And I'm going to start by showing you a couple of examples right down at the micro level of what that can look like. Well, I should say that, yeah, I'll just jump to the first bar chart. This is a picture of a before on the left and after on the right of an analysis of a single 30,000 square meter office building in Ontario that had a package of retrofit measures combined with a conversion from natural gas heating to electric heat pump system in a cold climate. And as you can see, the outcome that Yul referred to shows up even at this micro level. The gas is gone on the right-hand side. Electricity consumption has increased ever so slightly for this particular building. But in general, if you implement the new technologies for the efficient use of electricity, the new lighting technologies, not to mention the gains that you get in fans and pump savings when you make the transition to heat pump systems, the electricity that you will save in retrofitting the building to a higher level of efficiency and the equipment in it will be sufficient to run the heat pump that you need to replace the natural gas that was heating the building. And that's really good news. And in general, a lot of the work that we've been doing has been addressing either at a micro or at a larger community or a provincial level even, the question of what does the decarbonization transition, which necessarily will involve a lot of electrification, what does it really mean to the grid? Is it going to blow the grid? The very early decarbonization studies from 10 years ago that identified electrification as a key strategy tended to rather simplistically come to the conclusion that we were going to have to double or triple the supply of electricity. But since then, our understanding has deepened. The technologies have improved, especially these cold temperature heat pumps. The electric vehicle has come on strong. And we're now seeing more and more results like this, where we can make the transition to electricity without necessarily increasing the demand for electricity. Who would have thought? And in the next slide, the same building shows on the top pair the 8760 profile of electricity demand from this building in the summertime. And the bottom two charts, which you'll notice on the y-axis, are double the scale, 4,000 kilowatts instead of 2,000 peak on that y-axis, is what happens in the winter. These are average demands over the 3-month period for the average hour. In order to also, however, give an indication of the hourly peaks that occur, the fainter line that is drawn above the area chart represents the highest demand that occurred in that hour during whichever season is being portrayed. So you can see the extent to which you need to be prepared to meet peak demands that are considerably above the averages. And again, you can see the peak shifts from summer to winter. We see that consistently, obviously, with the shift from gas to electric heating. And overall demand, however, is not up dramatically. And the peak, which was, I'll just say briefly on that slide before we move on, the peak in this particular building, which was a summer peak at around 1,600 kilowatts, is now a winter peak at about 3,500. So that's an example where, yes, there's a very significant peak impact. Second example I just wanted to show is a very large complex, actually 4 very large interconnected buildings totaling 425,000 square meters, with a combination of gas and electric heating in the base conditions, which was moved over to a pure electric heat pump based system. And here we see actually at the end of the transition, total electricity consumption has actually come down slightly, even though all of the gas has been traded out and switched out. And one of the things that really helps is if there is any amount of resistance heating in the starting conditions, whether it's a residential or a commercial building situation, when you convert that resistance heating, whether it's space or water, to heat pump technology, you get a lot of freed up electricity supply, which is then available to be applied to the transition of any gas heated space over to electricity. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. The next slide, again, it just shows what happened to this particular building on an 8760 representation. Again, with the summer on the top, left is before, right is after, and the winter on the bottom. And here you can see both a peak saving, slight peak reduction, and a fairly significant reduction in total energy use as well as a result of the technologies that were implemented. Yul, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about this kind of result, and I'll hand it and what it starts to look like when you scale it up. Excuse me.
Yeah, so this is this is the 8760 for 3 scenarios. The baseline is the red in the background. The green is an electrification scenario only without doing a building retrofit, and then the yellow, which we call mountain caribou, we named all our scenarios after creatures, knocks those peaks down pretty significantly. And so I think part of the case we're trying to make is that without retrofits, the electrification agenda becomes much more complicated. But clearly, here's some quick impacts. The peak shifts to the winter from the summer's in the middle. And also the retrofit shifts the whole curve down. So those are the 2 big trajectories. And if we zoom in to a couple months, I'll start with, actually, I'll just show that shift. So there's an increase in the winter months, and obviously a significant savings in the summer. And this is zooming in to December. You can see that peak is the green. That's the heating peak that's now arriving on the electricity system as a result of electrification. If you do the retrofits, that peak drops down to 13. These are gigajoules. And then that's still more than twice the baseline level of 5.4 gigajoules. So even with the retrofits, we are getting twice the high peak for this specific building. If we zoom in to a couple of days, this is December 17th to 20th, you can see how the peak shifted. Again, the red is the baseline, the yellow is with retrofits, electrification, and the green is just electrification on its own. If we go to the summer, this is where we get a lot of the benefits. The retrofit really knocks down the electricity peaks, and that's because the air conditioning load decreases. So the red is the baseline and the yellow is both electrification and retrofit. And if we look in one day, July 6th, you can see how the curve is shifted down, really driven by the efficiency of the heat pumps and the retrofit. However, so there is a significant peak increase that we saw for this particular building, but when you bundle a whole bunch of buildings together, and this is almost 100 natural gas heated buildings, same kind of analysis in the city of Ottawa, the peak impact is much less significant. And that's because there's a mix of some electrification or electrically heated buildings and also the profiles of the buildings. And the orange is the impact of retrofit and peak. and heat pumps on peak. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's still some orange that sticks up above the blue, which is the baseline conditions. But it's not as significant as you saw when we looked at just one building. So that, I think, was a really important finding, is that when you electrify and retrofit a whole building stock, the impact on the grid is much less significant than when you look at one building. And then this is a sample of just electrically heated buildings from the Quebec side. And in this case, these buildings, it's just peak reductions because you're switching from electric baseboard or electric heating to heat pumps. And back to you, Ralph.
Yeah, well, just one last little section here, switching over to the residential context. And this little infographic is really just an attempt to illustrate the interconnectedness of the efficiency and the electrification of transportation and the introduction of heat pumps and so on, and the way that they work together to decarbonize. The top is represented by these 4 houses. One is heated with natural gas. The other 3 are heated with 3 are heated with natural gas, and 1 is heated with baseboard electricity. They all use lights and appliances at typical Canadian levels. They all have one car that goes about 25,000 kilometers a year at, I think, around 9 liters per 100K. And you end up with total electricity use of 200 gigajoules in this little hypothetical, although the numbers are realistic numbers, I should mention. And the total greenhouse gas emissions from this little cluster of 4 houses is 60 tons if the electricity supply is at 100 grams per kilowatt hour, which is higher than a lot of Canadian provinces and well below Alberta and Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. But I chose 100 just so you can scale it in your own mind. The grid, if the grid is carbon free, you're still left with about 40 tons from the fossil fuel consumption in this starting point. The bottom represents the post-retrofit, post-electrification scenario in this neighborhood. And we see that we do retrofits, we reduce the space heating requirements down to about 60 gigajoules, so about a 40% reduction in the tertiary heat requirements. We bring on heat pumps. We used a 290% COP, which is, quite achievable in most of southern Canada. It's low for the lower mainland of BC, but it's not a bad number to assume for cold weather heat pumps in southern Ontario or in most of Atlantic Canada. We assume an overall 25% of improvement in the efficiency of lights and appliances, and that's not a big reach. Electric vehicles for all 4 houses at 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. Total electricity use when you do all of this stays at 200 gigajoules, but the gas is gone and the gasoline is gone. And then we added solar to 2 of the houses at 4,000 kilowatt hours a year each on their rooftops, just to spice it up a bit. And we end up with total emissions in the post-retrofit, post-electrification, post-solar sort of scenario of 20 tons down from 60 if the grid is still at 100 grams per kilowatt hour. And of course, 0 emissions now if you can keep your grid at 0. And the one really central takeaway, everything that we're seeing and everything that we're learning or relearning as we do this work, is the importance of whole systems approaches to this kind of work. If you don't do the thermal retrofit of the house, you're going to put in the wrong heat pump and you're going to use more electricity to drive that heat pump. And that's going to make it harder to keep the grid or get the grid decarbonized. And there's all of these virtuous circles that occur between the efficiency and the electrification and the effort to either get to or maintain a carbon-free electricity grid. And if you focus on only one of the 3 legs of that stool, you will have suboptimal results and unintended and generally negative consequences. When you take this approach then and run it through our models, which is illustrated in this one last picture I wanted to put up on the next slide, This is for Nova Scotia. This is what you'll see at the top is the 8760 profile of electricity use in Nova Scotia before the retrofit and electrification, and the bottom is after. And the first thing you notice is that you can hardly tell them apart, except for the little orange band in there, which are the electric vehicles. And yet, the difference between the top and the bottom, and this is the big picture version of that micro phenomenon that we've been talking about, where we can electrify without increasing electricity use. We've electrified half the personal vehicles in the province. We've more than doubled the share of residential and commercial floor space that's being heated with electricity, combined with a phasing out of resistance heating. And we've retrofit the stock down about 43% for residential and 36% for commercial buildings in terms of its thermal efficiency. You do all of this together, then you have a much better chance of getting to a carbon-free grid that can supply it than if you only do the heat pumps without the retrofits, or if you only do the electrification without the efficiency more generally. So that's really the central message, I guess, that I would really like to put out there for my colleagues to consider in your work, is the importance of a whole systems integrated approach. The last slide that we have here is really just summing up a little bit things that I think points that we've already made. I'm just seeing if there's anything here that hasn't been said. And I don't think so, although, you know, the electric vehicle, we've only scratched the surface of what the electric vehicle is going to mean for the transformation of energy systems. The idea of having this much storage, which is portable, we have barely started to get our heads around the advantages that that presents to the way that we can manage and run our electricity distribution system. When you can move electricity around with millions of portable batteries, it could become actually a fairly important contribution at the community level to balancing the system. But even at the household level, most of the electricity in the EV battery is not going to be used on any given day. And it's a significant amount compared to household consumption. So we think that the EV is going to play it's going to play a much bigger role than we've yet even imagined in the way that neighborhood electricity supply and demand is going to play out. So I think that's, there's one last slide, but I'm not sure there's too much on it. Again, it's just re-emphasizing the point that I've been hammering at, which is the importance of the interconnections between efficiency, electrification, and carbonization. And the counterpart to that is that our business strategies and our policies also have to be integrated. And if you try to optimize on electricity, or if you try to optimize on efficiency, you're going to make a mess of things. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. Great presentation. We have 5 minutes for the questions. Some of the first questions are, first one is in fact about the payback for the whole system transformation that allows this outcome. Was that considered in the
yes.
exercise?
This type of modeling takes the traditional position of economic analysis and puts it in a different place in the sequence of analytical steps. Our approach is to try and find pathways that are physically and technologically, internally consistent, and which can achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve, which is almost always hitting a particular carbonization goal, a decarbonization goal. When we have done that, we then evaluate the cost and try to identify, you know, which is the most cost effective of the strategies. The way that that's done in the model is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bottom-up physical model. So capital costs are assigned to, incremental capital costs are assigned to everything that we put into these pathways, along with value of the energy savings, you know, to the extent that we have any clue, given the stranded assets problem that's going to come at us. Not to mention what any success at decarbonization is going to do to the price of fossil fuels. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the value of energy savings in the future, but we put all of that in there as best we can. Carbon savings, it's all very transparent. And then we do show the economic analysis of typically more than one pathway. But it's very much a scenario backcasting type approach. It's not an optimization approach. We don't think the system is a system that actually has an optimum. And so the attempt to find such a thing is somewhat futile.
I can also add, Ralph, that the financials for that portfolio buildings was quite compelling, and particularly once the new carbon price is added in from the federal government, it really helps with the differential cost between natural gas and electricity.
Thank you. Question on the reduction scenario. How are they defined? Are they chosen to match a jurisdiction target, or are they based on economic adoption?
We're always driving we usually use multiple scenarios. The scenarios that we showed just now were designed to achieve a particular target. We typically use other scenarios that show different penetrations or adoption rates.
Thanks. And Ralph, you insisted on the fact that it needs to be a system approach, so to realize all the gains. But do you see a kind of a problem with the transition period, or the time frame by which all of those transformations need to be made? Is there like a risk in this?
Yes, it's a huge challenge. Some things more than others. I think that the biggest challenge will be the refitting of the building stock. The transition to low carbon in general is very capital intensive, and it's expensive, which is not, no big deal. I mean, tar sands and nuclear power plants are incredibly expensive, and yet there they are. And all we do is pay our $1 a liter or our 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And we need analogous financial infrastructure to get ourselves organized in order to deliver the retrofits in particular, which are going to require an industry that doesn't really exist right now. Not unlike the transition that occurred in automobile manufacturing over a 10-year period between 1912 and 1922, when the price of a Model T went down by 80% at the same time that the car got better. And we need something like that to happen with respect to the way we're thinking about how we get the job done with the buildings. For the vehicles and a number of, and for the development of the carbon-free electricity supply, you can start to see the business and financial and logistical infrastructure taking shape as we speak. But we're still struggling to see what the business and logistical and financial strategy going forward is going to be that will get the retrofits in place on a timeline that matters to the climate problem.
Yeah, and make sure that we have the workforce, the right workforce, and the right people in place to and coordinate all of that. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a call. That's bring us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much again. We'll switch to our third and final presentation of the day by Kevin Palmer Wilson from University of Victoria, who will talk about electricity and renewable gas in BC. So please take the control of the screen.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Palmer Wilson. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn off my video in order to do that. Now, the million-dollar question is, can you all see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you all for coming to my presentation on electricity and renewable gas system alternatives for fossil fuel substitution in British Columbia. That's a mouthful. I'm a postdoc at the University of Victoria at the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems, and we partnered with Fortis BC for the past year, and we're actually extending this project for another 2 years. And what I'm going to show you today are preliminary results, but the reason why we thought this fit well into the energy modeling initiative is because of the data challenge, which I'm going to get into here in a second. So the data that we use is mostly publicly available. We did have to use some proprietary data, and the model is also open source. So without further ado, I'm going to get into it. What we're doing is we're comparing electrification with renewable gas alternatives. So these are mutually exclusive pathways in this analysis that I'm presenting you here. And the purpose of this is to decarbonize the heating sector in Metro Vancouver. Now you'll notice right away, Metro Vancouver is not British Columbia, and this was really dictated by the lack of data availability, where we had to focus on Metro Vancouver instead of all of British Columbia. What we wanted to do is understand the energy system requirements that would come from either electrification or using renewable gas to decarbonize the heating system. So what I'm going to talk to you about today are the policy motivations behind this analysis, the emissions and the energy demand in Metro Vancouver, the energy demand profiles that we had to create in order to make this analysis work, and the model and scenario that we developed in order to investigate these pathways. And then I'm going to show you results, so pathway comparisons for capacity and storage requirements and the costs of these pathways. And then I'm going to leave you with some takeaways and next steps. This is a photo of beautiful downtown Vancouver. Vancouver is really a beautiful place, and it is actually a good place to investigate decarbonization of the building heating sector for BC, because Metro Vancouver houses 2.5 million persons, which is 53% of British Columbia's population. So if we can decarbonize Metro Vancouver, we're a good step toward decarbonizing British Columbia. But of course, that's not the whole picture, because the communities outside of Metro Vancouver have different needs than Metro Vancouver. Nevertheless, because of data availability, we're focusing on Metro Vancouver here. The greenhouse gas policies are in place at all levels. British Columbia wants to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. Metro Vancouver wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. The City of Vancouver wants to use 100% renewable energy, up from about 31% today. So the incentives are there to decarbonize. Just so we understand what we're talking about here, if you've been to Vancouver, it's Metro Vancouver is located in southwestern British Columbia. The City of Vancouver is around here, and the Metro Vancouver Regional District, which I'm talking about, is actually a much larger area. Looking at the emissions, these are the emissions for 2018, and the sector that we're focusing on are the residential building and the commercial building heating sector. And you can immediately see that the emissions are dominated by the transportation and the building sector, which means that if we want to substitute fuels for the space heating and the water heating that's consumed in the commercial and the residential building sector, then we do make a substantial contribution toward emission reductions, but it's not all the way there. So the reason why I'm pointing this out is because the challenge is grander than the results that I'm presenting today. In terms of the fuel consumption that we see, this is for 2016 in these sectors, I'm plotting here the secondary energy contained in the fuel that was consumed in Metro Vancouver. This is actually based on data for BC, scaled to Metro Vancouver by 53%. But what you can see here is that obviously the transportation sector requires a large amount of liquid fuels. But what I really want to focus your attention on is the electricity demand that is a large share of the total energy consumption, and this is other electricity, which includes only the appliances, lights, and so on. So not heating, so not water heating, not space heating, but some of the water heating and some of the space heating was already electrified in 2016. But the larger share is really this natural gas, water, and space heating, which would need to be replaced if we are serious about decarbonization. Now, one of the options to do that is obviously electrification, which increases the demand for energy and power. Now, we know that there is surplus energy in BC available. The amount of surplus power is actually quite difficult to determine. And just around BC, 91% of the electricity in BC is produced by hydropower. Approximately 1/3 of that energy can be dispatched on a flexible schedule. And the reason why it's not more than that is because BC is constrained by the freshet water inflows in early summer, by flood control, by keeping the rivers at certain temperatures. It's a complex system of other constraints that are not directly only related to producing electricity. We know that surplus energy and capacity that's available now can substitute some fossil fuels, but it's not quite clear how much surplus capacity is really available. And the reason is that the boundaries between the data sources differ, and there's insufficient data documentation. So I want to show you on this graph the problem with these different data sources. What we see here in the red line on top is BC Hydro's 2018 effective load carrying capability based on their revenue requirements application. And you can see that this line just exceeds the green line here, which is the all-time peak balancing authority load. So it looks like the load in British Columbia is almost as high as the load carrying capability, which means that, well, if the green line exceeds the red line, that's a bad thing. But the problem here is that this is actually based on two slightly different data sources. So the BC Hydro's load carrying capability is based on BC Hydro as an electricity supplier, but BC Hydro doesn't supply all electricity in British Columbia. There are other smaller suppliers. The load is based on the balancing authority. Now, BC Hydro acts as the balancing authority in British Columbia, which means that it is responsible for balancing load and demand in real time on the integrated transmission system. But the balancing authority and BC Hydro are still not the same entities. And this is why the two different data sources here don't necessarily match. The boundaries around those data sources don't necessarily match. Another problem is that the imports and exports that I've plotted down here, clearly BC Hydro exports more electricity than it imports, but we don't actually know based on the data documentation whether these imports and exports are included in this load. So figuring out the surplus capacity is a challenge. For the purpose of this study, we just assume that these are the same, but that is probably not the case. So that certainly warrants further investigation. In terms of energy demand, when we replace fossil fuels with renewables, then we need to have a good understanding of what the hourly demand profiles look like. So we created space heat, water heat, and electricity demand profiles based on different data sources, because getting hourly demand data is actually quite challenging. So this what I'm plotting you here is the end-use demand, first of all, for electricity for a 1-year period, so from the first hour to the 8,760th hour. This is based on BC Hydro's telemetered load, but we've taken out the space and water heat demand, and that's why this is flat for this 1-year period. rather than varying seasonally. The same is true for the water heating demand. So the water heating demand is based on a tool from Ontario. The water heating demand doesn't fluctuate much when you compare summertime and wintertime. But that's different for the space heat demand. So the space heat demand we created is based, first of all, on BC Hydro residential demand data. So we got data for 5,000 households in British Columbia that allowed us to deduce the space heat demand in 2016. But the problem was that 2016 was not a particularly cold year, and we wanted to investigate the effects of what happens if there's a cold snap and we need to design the system for a cold period. So we did temperature regression analysis, which means that we took the 2016 heat demand, created a regression analysis with 2016 recorded temperatures in Metro Vancouver, and created an equation of best fit, and then applied that to temperature data for other years. And we found that 1996 actually had the lowest minimum temperature recorded in the data set in Metro Vancouver. It was minus 16 degrees in that year. And that year also had the third highest number of heating degree days. So we applied this regression analysis to 1996 temperature data and produced this space heat demand profile. And you'll see immediately that the peak demand here is much higher than using the 2016 profile. But there is some considerable uncertainty around this demand profile. But the key here is that the peak at the end of January for about a 5-day period exceeds BC Hydro's current load carrying capability, and it's just below 12 gigawatt here. So everything in these plots is scaled to Metro Vancouver. So basically scaled from BC to Metro Vancouver by 53%. I'm very briefly only going to talk about the model. The energy system model that we use is based on the open source energy system model Osmosis. We've implemented a 1-year hourly optimization. So Osmosis is a linear capacity expansion and dispatch model that minimizes the total cost of the system for this 1-year period that we implemented. But the model has to supply all energy demands, which in our case are electricity, space heat, and water heat. And it has to do so by gradually replacing natural gas in increments. So it can do so either via electrification, which means it replaces gas furnaces with heat pumps in order to reduce natural gas consumption and use more electricity. Or the system can use biogas, but biogas, there's a limited supply of biogas available, and when that runs out, the model can install electrolyzers to use more electricity to produce hydrogen. If the model needs more energy, it can install wind, solar, storage, and electrolyzers in order to produce and store that energy. The scenarios that we devised are designed to capture some uncertainties. I'm not going to show you all the scenarios here that we implemented. We implemented a much larger range of scenarios, but I'm going to focus on 2 different scenarios. So in terms of resources, we had a lower and a higher estimate for biogas supply, the lower estimate being the amount of biogas that would be needed to reach the mandated 15% of gas supplied from renewable sources by 2030, and the higher end including an estimate on wood gasification that would increase the biogas supply in British Columbia. In terms of the demands, we only compared these 2 demand profiles, the 1996, which has the higher space heat demand, and the 2016 temperatures, which has the lower space heat demand. So in terms of results, What I'm showing you here are the results for the electrification scenario as the system increases the share of, reduces the share of natural gas from 0 to 100%. So it replaces natural gas in 10% increments. This is essentially at 0% the status quo as the energy system was in 2016. And at 100%, no natural gas is used. All the natural gas is replaced with electricity. We run this model over and over again. So these are the results for a 1-year period. So each one of these represents a 1-year model run. And what you can see is that hydroelectricity remains unchanged. We assume that more hydroelectricity cannot be installed, more hydro capacity. But as the system replaces natural gas, the model needs to install more wind, solar, and electricity storage. Now, in comparison to the renewable natural gas pathway, the same thing is true. We replace natural gas first with biogas, which you see here up to the 30% mark, and at that point the model needs to produce hydrogen in order to replace natural gas, and it does so by installing more wind and solar power. Now I want to focus on the energy capacity, the storage capacity. So what you see here is the installed capacity in terms of electricity storage, but the energy capacity of this electricity storage actually varies quite a bit between the scenarios. These whiskers here delineate the range that we see across all the scenarios, and the electricity storage ranges from 4 to 80 gigawatt hours. So that's quite a big range. 80 gigawatt hours would be equivalent to 8 pumped storage facilities just to electrify the heating system. And the reason why this range is so big is it's really driven by this peak space heat demand that we see in the 1996 temperature space heat demand profile, where the demand exceeds the load carrying capability. And that's really what drives this. In the natural gas pathway, the storage, actually the required storage is much larger, but I've cut this off here because I wanted to focus on the electricity storage capacity because it's much higher cost. So for comparison, so this actually goes up to, the gas storage capacity goes up to about 1,000 gigawatt hours. But for comparison, the Aitken Creek gas storage facility in northeastern British Columbia can store about 80,000 gigawatt hours. The last graph I want to show you are costs. So these are the annualized costs for a 1-year period. So because when you install wind, solar, storage, these technologies have a lifetime of more than 1 year, we've discounted this for a 1-year period. And you can see again that these whiskers delineate the range of costs that we see across all the scenarios. And what I want to focus on here is just this very large range that we see in the electrification pathway versus the smaller range in the renewable gas pathway. And again, the reason why this happens is really the storage that is driven by the peak demand exceeding hydro's load carrying capability. In the renewable gas pathway, this is actually driven by the biogas availability. So biogas is lower cost than hydrogen, and that's why the cost drivers in the renewable gas pathway are the biogas availability. I should note that the costs that we're including here are just the gas and electricity production and storage. It does not include things like retrofitting heaters. So if we were to switch our heating system, our furnaces to heaters that consume hydrogen, that would certainly need some change in that technology. That's not included here. I'm also not including transmission and distribution costs, and especially upgrading costs for these, for both gas and electricity transmission and distribution. The takeaways from this are, first of all, I want to point out that these are preliminary results. really what we wanted to see is what drives these costs and what drives the storage requirements in order to be able to then focus our attention to where we have to improve our estimate and our data availability in order to improve this analysis as a whole. But the preliminary results show that either pathway can be lower cost, but the cost range is smaller in the renewable gas pathway. And the biggest cost drivers here really are the peak demand that exceeds hydro's load carrying capability. So if we need to supply demand for an extended period of time while there's no other dispatchable capacity alternative available, then storage, electricity storage would need to fill in, and that's really not feasible. The model is available at this link, so you can download it and play with it. The conclusions that we can take away here are that dispatchable capacity has high value, but avoiding the peak demand increase also has high value. And I want to be careful with this conclusion here. Maybe it's better to electrify summer peaking sectors. So because we already have a winter peaking electricity demand, adding to the electricity demand by increasing the winter peak by electrifying the building heating sector may not be the best use of the available capacity and energy that we have if other sectors are able to reduce emissions at lower cost using that energy. The results really are sensitive to the existing capacity. So this is really going to be something that we need to focus our attention on as we go forward. So our next steps are to improve that available capacity estimate, improve the demand profile in terms of their impact on, in terms of impacts of energy efficiency improvements. So one of the comments that we've often received is we need to include efficiency improvement, especially for the building step code. We can't just assume that retrofitting buildings will have energy. We need to improve our scenario assumptions in terms of stakeholders connection. I just want to make sure that I'm still. Can you still hear me?
Yes. Now
am I still?
It's better. We lost you for maybe 20 seconds.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm almost at the end. So we're getting stakeholder comments. We need to investigate the operation of the coupled electricity and gas system in terms of its resilience. We want to investigate pathways to net zero emissions. And we want to include a spatial analysis in terms of where to put the electrolyzers and which corridors need to be upgraded in terms of electricity and gas transmission. That's it. Sorry, because I cut out there, I cut this short a little bit. I hope this. I hope you got the most of the presentation.
Yes, we did. We just lost you for maybe, at least on my side, for maybe 20 seconds. It was kind of hard to hear you. That's a great presentation. Thank you. There are many questions, and I would ask maybe Ralph Torrey, you have a couple of questions. Maybe you can ask them directly, please.
Okay, if I can remember them. I was just firing them off while you were speaking.
Well,
I was wondering though whether you had looked, for example, at the potential for heat pumps to reduce your winter peak. You said that electrifying heat, but a lot of your heat is already resistance heating in BC. And couldn't you actually reduce your winter peak by converting that? And my other question was whether you looked at the potential for decentralized storage via vehicle to grid systems. There's going to be a lot of electricity in EV batteries on any given day that's not going to be used for anything else. So just wondered if that's on your radar.
Yeah, those are two excellent questions, especially in terms of heat pumps. So I didn't show this earlier because it's a fairly complex model, but this is what the entire model looks like in a flow diagram. So we've got our electricity, space heat, and water heat demands here. The way this model operates is it's got heaters that need energy from all these different energy sources. And the model has installed the existing baseboard and furnace heaters. So the heating that's supplied by electricity today is mostly baseboard, or at least in 2016, it was mostly baseboard. It was only about 3% heat pumps. And then furnaces obviously use natural gas. In order to look at the electrification scenario, the model actually replaces these furnaces with heat pumps. And the efficiency that we used for these heat pumps was temperature dependent. I don't have a slide on that here, but the coefficient of performance ranges from about 1.4 at the coldest temperature, so at minus 16 degrees, to I think about 2.8 at the cutoff 18 degrees centigrade, where no heating is longer required.
That's not what we're seeing in the field from the latest generation of cold weather heat pumps. We're seeing at 0, 5 above 0, around 3.4, 3.5, and at minus 20, we're still getting 2.0. So are you
okay?
Are you keeping a watching brief on what's going on with heat pumps? Because they're getting better.
Somewhat. In terms of the actual efficiency, we used a report. I don't remember the source right now. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. It's a report where they investigated different types of models that were installed in the field in Massachusetts, and they looked at data for a 2-year period, which was I think 2016 and 2017. So yes, that data is outdated, and thank you for that comment. So 0 degrees centigrade, 3.5, a COP of 3.5, that's a substantial improvement. That's substantially better than what we're assuming here. So that's certainly something that we're going to update in our model going forward, because that will make a difference in terms of that peak.
You know, the NRC is doing field research with Canadian conditions. And it's just taking them. I've seen some of the data, but it's not published. It's very frustrating because that's what I was just talking about a moment ago. You know, they're seeing this more or less linear deterioration from 3.5 at 5 Celsius down to about 2.0 at minus 20. But they're, you know,
yeah,
they've had these numbers for almost a year and they're still not published. So hopefully they'll come out.
Yeah, I actually had trouble finding a good overarching analysis of heat pump information of coefficients of performance versus temperature for a broad range of heat pumps. You can find this for individual heat pumps, but it's not clear how this would affect, you know, if the entire building stock were retrofitted with heat pumps. Obviously, there would be a range of different models. Yeah. So it would be good to have a sense of that range.
One of the things that I understand is the case about this NRC empirical data is that it's lining up with the manufacturer's claimed performance, and so they're basically saying, you know, if you're looking at performance specs being published by a reputable manufacturer, you can probably depend on them from what they're seeing in the field. Because you can find that, right? You can find spec sheets on these things, but you're always wondering, can you rely on the manufacturer's stated performance? Apparently you can.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, there's a fast-moving field.
Yeah, that's definitely something we're going to look into. In terms of vehicle to grid, we didn't include that here, but I would argue that the amount of energy storage that's required in our electrification scenario really just means that storage can be anywhere, whether that's stationary storage or mobile storage, doesn't really matter. So, you know, you can just back calculate how many vehicles you would need in order to have the lower end 4 gigawatt hours of storage.
I'm wondering, is anybody looking at and I don't want to hog the mic, sorry, Louise, but is anybody looking at the question of where in the hierarchy of the electricity transmission and distribution system is the application of storage capacity most effective, both technologically and from a cost effectiveness point of view? Especially if you've got these vehicles anyway, right, with surplus stored electricity, and they may be able to take pressure off local distribution systems in neighborhoods that are electrifying more effectively than, say, a large utility storage battery 100 miles away. I don't know, but I'm just wondering if that's a research topic that anybody's...
This is certainly taken into consideration in many modeling exercises I've seen, but there's still it's still a question to be answered as where should we put the storage in? I guess it's on a case-by-case basis, right? And we have to know how the demand will evolve, in fact, because it can relieve the grid in many ways. But yes, that's one study to be done, certain. That brings us at the end of our 30-minute period. In fact, we ran a bit long, but that was interesting. So I didn't want to cut this conversation. I will thank you all. And before leaving, I just want to do a bit of advertising for our upcoming sessions. We still have 3 additional sessions to present the other projects that have been funded or submitted on a voluntary basis. You still have time to register for those sessions at the link that you see on or the URL that you can see on my slides. And with that, I will thank you all. Please stay safe, and if you have any questions, please post them to us, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can. Well, thank you, and see you soon.